As we continue our discussion of the labor market in this module, we'll finally take a look at the natural rate of unemployment and unemployment in the PPF, or the production possibility frontier. First, let's consider the natural rate of unemployment by asking ourselves, is there anything natural about unemployment? Well, if we think about it, a perfectly free labor market, well, that was a terrible line. A perfectly free labor market where we have some labor and some wage, some labor supply and some labor demand, we would expect this in a free market, that this market would equilibrate or have some market clearing level of L star and W star, or some wage would arrive at which labor supply and labor demand were equal to each other. This is called equilibrium, or the market clearing level, such that all labor supplied is similarly demanded. There is no labor left available in the market, either for supply or demand at that wage. Well, in this case, is unemployment natural? Well, in this case, it looks like no. At a given wage, there's going to be a clearing market. But we would argue that perhaps that's not the end of the story. In fact, if we think about it, there's some natural rate of unemployment that arises because of frictional unemployment in a marketplace, which you'll recall from a prior segment is that unemployment that just takes place because of relatively, if not perfectly, efficient transactions. A job that one ends on day one, but doesn't begin a new job until day 15, maybe because of migration across the country, purposeful time off, what have you, will yield some very modest level of unemployment. Obviously, then some structure in the economy having to do with deficit spending preferences, money supply preferences, whether or not there's unemployment insurance, the presence of contracts, etc. So exogenous interferences in the market, structural exogenous interferences in the market will yield some unemployment as well. So a natural rate of unemployment might arise for an economy based on the frictional level of unemployment and the structural rates of unemployment, or structural levels of unemployment. If we think about this then as the structure of a marketplace motivates greater levels of unemployment, then the natural rate of unemployment might rise. As the structure in a marketplace motivates lower levels, then the natural rate of unemployment might fall. We can't necessarily say that there is a set value of unemployment, set rate of unemployment that would be the, quote, natural rate. But we do believe that the natural rate of unemployment is somewhere about 5%. The current structure of the U.S. economy, the longer-term structure of the U.S. economy is such that unemployment tends to settle in at around 5%, absent other shocks, absent other interventions or interferences, certainly exogenous ones. Well, we also have to think about whether or not business, even very competitive business and very competitive markets, rely on unemployment, and I think we'd have to agree that yes, of course they do. If you have created a new technology or a new product, you'd like to create a manufacturing facility, you'd like to market your product, you're certainly going to have to find workers. Let's say that you're going to choose to find those workers domestically, and you're going to have to find those workers. Well, if everyone is employed, then you entering this market as a new employer will simply raise the level of wage, which will make it that much harder for you to manufacture your product at a low cost such that you can sell it at a reasonable cost and still have reasonable expectation of profit. So we actually do have some reliance on a pool of unemployed individuals. And this frictional unemployment certainly provides a little bit of that, but our structural unemployment provides some of it as well. And because of this reliance, we have this institution that has arisen that we refer to as unemployment insurance that helps provide some minimal level of income for the unemployed as they're waiting for jobs in this marketplace. So this unemployment that arises because of this frictional and structural relationship, and because of businesses' reliance on unemployment to keep wages low and to have a ready supply of workers when new jobs are created, both of those we would think of them as relatively natural for the economy. This leads us to something often referred to as the NAIRU. NAIRU, the NAIRU, or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment? Well, if you think about it, if unemployment rises above a natural rate, let's say, that means that demand has weakened. Think about the business cycle. That probably also means that wages are declining, and that means that prices perhaps are declining, in which case inflation is not accelerating. In fact, maybe inflation is decelerating. So that would be a unemployment above the NAIRU, or above possibly a natural rate. Similarly, if unemployment fell below a natural rate, so much so that it motivated inflation changes. We're always going to have a little bit of inflation. We want to have a little bit of inflation in the economy. I believe the Federal Reserve target is approximately 2% or 2.5% inflation. That's the case for most economies in the developed world. Then if unemployment falls below a natural rate such that more goods and services are being demanded, more people are being employed, we have a tighter labor market, maybe wages are being bid up because of this. Think about the supply and demand relationship. That's probably at the very least pushing wages up a little, so more money floating around in the economy to buy more goods and services. This would change the inflation rate from maybe 2% or currently less than 1% to a higher rate. And that higher rate may be productive. If we went from 1% inflation today to 2%, I don't think anyone within our policy making bodies would be too concerned about that. But if it went from 1% to 5%, that would be problematic. So this would suggest that there is some rate of unemployment at which the inflation rate remains relatively constant. Unemployment above that rate causes inflation's rate to decline. Unemployment below that rate causes inflation's rate to increase. And then finally, we have to think about something referred to as hysteresis. This is something that gives us this is something that affects the long-term rate of unemployment. And we would think of the natural rate and even the NAIRU as being longer-term rates. So think about hysteresis. If one is out of a job, let's say it's a high-skilled job in information technology. If one is out of a job for a few days or a few weeks in information technology, that's probably not a bad sign. One does not begin to lose their skills sufficiently rapidly as to see them depreciate. One's networks, both business and social, that help them find jobs in many cases have not begun to fall apart. And so a few weeks of unemployment probably doesn't mean that that one is destined for yet longer periods of unemployment over time and or lower incomes because of skills and or network depreciation. But what happens to that same IT worker if unemployment has lingered for them for a year, which in the more recent recession, there are some people, perhaps not IT, but certainly in many parts of the marketplace, that remained unemployed for well over a year. We called, in fact, sometimes even 2 years plus. What happens to their skill levels and what happens to the networks through which they very often will find their next job? Well, if they're not employed, they probably don't have the money to stay on top of cutting-edge technologies. They don't continue to be trained, and so they see a depreciation in their skill levels because technology and required skills are changing at a pace rapidly enough that if they're not being replenished, maintained, they clearly do depreciate. This is one of the places in which we can think of labor or the human being as being capital, because capital certainly depreciates over time, if not reinvested and if not added to. Similarly, if I am that person and I've been unemployed for a couple of years, now those people that I know in decision-making positions at different firms, perhaps are no longer there. I've not continued to socialize. I've not maintained those contacts, and so it becomes even harder for me to find a job. When we see periods of prolonged higher unemployment, then we are concerned that that might lead to long-term higher and more persistent unemployment because of this hysteresis effect. So hysteresis is a valid concern amongst labor economists, and increasing periods of unemployment may beget increasing periods of unemployment. Well, those all make sense to us. So yes, maybe there is something natural about unemployment, and we can think about it in terms of the types of unemployment. We can think about businesses' reliance on it. We can think about it in terms of changes in inflation rates, and we can think about it in terms of long-term changes in skill levels, which for an entire economy, if long-term skill levels go down, then maybe long-term unemployment goes up, or maybe even a similarly poor alternative arises, and that's that we no longer efficiently utilize all of our labor capacity. You've probably studied the production possibility frontier in either economics courses, or certainly as you've considered how does a nation value itself, or what creates the situation in which a nation has efficient use of all the resources. And we know that when a nation has efficient use of all of its resources, that we can map those out on something referred to as a production possibility frontier, such that on this axis we're looking at the production of consumables. On the x-axis, we're looking at production of capital. We're thinking of those two labels, capital and consumables, as encompassing all goods and services produced in a marketplace. And if this market used all of its productive capacity to make capital, then the capital would be manufactured at this level, whatever it happens to be. Or if it used all of its productive goods and services, or all of its productive capacity, human capital, technology, plants and equipment, land, etc., geographic, climatic resources, if you used all of it to manufacture consumables, then the consumables level would be somewhere at approximately this point. And we know that on a production possibility frontier, any point or any combination of capital and consumables, such as A, or maybe there's another one here at B or C, what have you, any combination of capital and consumables manufactured such that it had a point, or resided at a point on this production possibility frontier, that would be considered efficiently utilizing all the productive resources of an economy. So, in this respect, we can think of, if we have a point A that is on the production possibility frontier, that point of unemployment, or unemployment that yields that point of production that's on this frontier, is likely going to be an unemployment at the natural rate. So utilizing things as efficiently as the frictional and structural elements of the economy will allow for. However, if there is some point of unemployment that is below the natural rate, it says above here, but it should not. It should say below the natural rate. Then wages would rise, and we would see some inflation occur, perhaps. But more importantly, we consider this outside of the production possibility frontier. In fact, when we're outside of the production possibility frontier, even if for a brief period of time, then it's not feasible, and inflation will rise, and it'll create some difficulties for us. So this is using our productive resources too aggressively, such that unemployment is below the natural rate. Again, excuse where I say above. That should have said below. And we'll see rising wages. Well, what happens if just the opposite is the case? If we actually have rates above the natural rate, unemployment above the natural rate, that means that we're risking a recession. This is no longer efficient use of our productive capacity as a nation. We know that we have some of our citizens, some of our potential workers that are now unemployed where they would prefer not to be. That's not an efficient use of a nation's productive resources, and we likely then see that we're inside of the PPF. The real danger here isn't simply being inside or outside. The real danger here is that when we are inside of a production possibility frontier, then we are producing less of capital and or consumable than is optimal for the economy. Let's say it's at C prime and at K prime. And if we're using less, then we have less capital that we're accumulating. The sole purpose to accumulate capital in a society is to make production or returns more easily obtained or more robust, of higher values in a future period of time. Well, if we are only producing a lower level of them, then we're not likely to be able to push this production possibility frontier out and to the right as rapidly as we'd like. We'd like to see it pushed out and to the right every period, or worse still, if this K prime rate of capital that we are creating, forming, producing within this one period that we're measuring here, if it was less than the depreciation on the existing capital stock, then it might motivate a decrease or a inward movement of the production possibility frontier, which would cause the economy to begin to shrink, and maybe shrink at a faster rate. We would no longer be as competitive on the global scale, and would probably see development losses for the economy. Standards of living would decrease generally.